Racist millionaire humiliates black maid. The visitor at his door the next morning shocks him. Helen Brooks, a 62-year-old maid newly employed at the luxurious Imperial Grand Hotel, smoothed down her crisp red and white uniform, steeling herself for another day of invisibility after decades of service jobs, including over 20 years at a diner. Kora found herself starting anew in this world of wealth and luxury. Little did she know her day was about to take a shocking turn when Charles Blackwood, a millionaire VIP guest, summoned Cora to his suite. She never expected the encounter that would follow. The events behind those closed doors would leave Kora shaken to her core and change her life forever. What unspeakable event transpired in that lavish suite that could break the spirit of a woman who had weathered decades of hardship? And how would a simple knock on the millionaire's door the next morning change the lives of everyone at the Imperial Grand Hotel? Let's find out, but before we dive in, comment below where you're watching or listening from today. And if you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe. The soft glow of the bedside lamp illuminated Cora Brooks's weathered hands as she carefully buttoned up her crisp red and white uniform. At 62, her fingers weren't as nimble as they once were, but they moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime in service. She smoothed down the front of her dress, her reflection in the small mirror above her dresser, revealing a woman who carried herself with quiet dignity despite the weight of years. Kora's small apartment was modest, but tidy, a testament to her meticulous nature. As she gathered her things for the day ahead, her eyes lingered on a faded photograph of a younger version of herself standing proud in front of a diner where she had worked for over 2 decades. That job, like so many others, had come and gone, leaving Cora to face the harsh reality that retirement was a luxury she couldn't afford. The pre-dawn chill nipped at her skin as she stepped out onto the quiet street. The bus ride to the Imperial Grand Hotel was a stark journey from one world to another. As the neighborhoods grew more affluent, Kay felt increasingly out of place, a feeling she had grown accustomed to over the years, but never quite accepted. The Imperial Grand loomed before her, its gleaming facade a monument to wealth and privilege. Kora took a deep breath, steeling herself for another day of invisibility. She slipped through the employee entrance, exchanging quiet nods with other workers beginning their shifts. The grandeur of the hotel's lobby never failed to overwhelm her, its opulence a sharp contrast to the simple life she led. As Cora made her way through the back corridors, she observed the morning routines of the hotel coming to life. Chefs barked orders in the kitchen, the clatter of pots and pans creating a chaotic symphony. Bellhops rushed to and fro, their smart uniforms a blur of motion. And then there were the other maids, some younger, some closer to Kora's age, all moving with purpose, their carts laden with fresh linens and cleaning supplies. She reached the supply closet, methodically stocking her cart with everything she'd need for the day. Each item had its place, a small semblance of control in a world where she often felt powerless. As she worked, Cora couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation from her colleagues. "Did you see the guest list for this week?" one young maid whispered excitedly. "There's supposed to be some big-shot millionaire checking in." "Great," another replied sarcastically. "Another entitled rich guy who thinks the sun shines out of his shoe. Want to get fired?" Cora said nothing, keeping her head down as she always did. She had learned long ago that in places like this, being seen or heard often led to trouble. As she pushed her cart out into the hallway, the plush carpet muffling the wheels, she couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Something about the day ahead felt different, charged with an energy she couldn't quite name. The first few hours of her shift passed in a blur of routine tasks. Cora moved from room to room, her movements efficient and practiced. She changed linens with hospital corners so crisp they could cut paper, dusted surfaces until they gleamed, and scrubbed bathrooms to a spotless shine. In each room, she erased all evidence of human presence, preparing the space for the next guest who would barely acknowledge her existence. As she worked, Kora's mind wandered to the life she had lived. Decades of service jobs had left their mark, not just in the calluses on her hands, but in the way she carried herself, always slightly hunched, always ready to step aside, to fade into the background. She thought of the dreams she had once harbored, of a life where her hard work would be recognized, where she could hold her head high. But those dreams had long since faded, replaced by the simple hope of making it through another day, another week, another year. The loneliness that had become her constant companion settled around her like a familiar blanket in this world of Luxury and excess COR felt more isolated than ever. The wealthy guests who passed her in the hallways looked through her as if she were part of the furniture. Her colleagues, while not unkind, were caught up in their own struggles, leaving little room for meaningful connection. As the morning wore on, Kora found herself on the top floor reserved for the hotel's most exclusive suites. The carpet here was thicker, the wallpaper more ornate, the very air seeming to shimmer with privilege. She paused for a moment, leaning on her cart, the weight of her years and her circumstances pressing down on her shoulders. In that quiet moment, standing alone in the opulent hallway, Cor allowed herself a rare indulgence. She closed her eyes and imagined just for a second what it would be like to be one of the guests, to walk with confidence, to be seen, to matter. The fantasy was fleeting, shattered by the sharp ring of a nearby house phone. Reality reasserted itself, and Cor opened her eyes, her expression sudden back into the mask of quiet subservience she had worn for so long. She straightened up, adjusted her uniform, and pushed her cart forward. Whatever the day might bring, she would face it as she had faced every other challenge in her life, with resilience, dignity, and the quiet strength that had sustained her for 62 years. Little did Kora know that this day would challenge her strength in unexpected ways, initiating a series of events that would make her quest long-held beliefs about herself and the world around her. The hushed whispers that had been circulating among the staff all morning suddenly intensified. Cor, who had been diligently polishing the brass fixtures in one of the hallways, felt the change in the air before she saw its cause. The elevator at the end of the corridor dinged, and out stepped a man who seemed to command the very space around him. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Kora made in a year. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly coiffed, giving him an air of aristocratic disdain. This, Cor realized, must be the VIP millionaire everyone had been talking about. Flanking the man were two assistants, both young and sharply dressed, tapping furiously on their tablets. Behind them came a procession of bellhops, struggling under the weight of numerous expensive-looking suitcases. The group moved down the hallway like a small parade, the VIP at its center radiating an aura of entitlement that seemed to push everything else to the periphery. Cor instinctively stepped back, pressing herself against the wall, trying to make herself as inconspicuous as possible. But as the entourage passed, the VIP's gaze swept over her, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he had spotted a speck of dust in his otherwise pristine world. "You there," he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Flinched, realizing he was addressing her. "Make sure my rooms are spotless. I won't tolerate any oversights." The way he said the last word made it clear that he expected nothing less than perfection. Before Kora could respond, the group had moved on, disappearing around the corner towards the most luxurious suite in the hotel. She stood there for a moment, her heart racing, feeling as if she had just been struck by a cold wind. No sooner had the VIP and his entourage vanished from sight than Kora's manager, Mr. Thompson, came hurrying down the hallway. His usually ruddy face was even redder than usual, a sheen of sweat visible on his forehead. "Brooks," he hissed, grabbing Kora's arm and pulling her aside. "Did you see him? That was Mr. Charles Blackwood III. He's one of the most influential businessmen in the country, and he's staying with us for the next week." Cor nodded silently, still processing the encounter. "Listen to me very carefully." Mr. Thompson continued, his grip on her arm tightening slightly. "Mr. Blackwood is extremely important to this hotel. His stay here could mean big things for all of us. You understand?" Again, Kora nodded. "Good. Now I'm assigning you to be on call for any of Mr. Blackwood's needs, whatever he wants, whenever he wants it. You drop everything and make it happen. Is that clear?" "Yes, Mr. Thompson," Cor replied softly, her stomach nodding with anxiety. "And Brooks," he added, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "if anything goes wrong, if Mr. Blackwood is unhappy in any way, it's on you. Do you understand what I'm saying?" The threat was clear in his tone. Cor swallowed hard and nodded once more. "Excellent, Mr. Thompson," said, his face suddenly splitting into a wide false smile. "Now, Mr. Blackwood has requested a glass of our finest red wine to be brought to his suite in precisely 30 minutes. You'll handle that, won't you, Brooks?" It wasn't really a question, and they both knew it. Kora murmured her assent, and Mr. Thompson strode away, already barking orders at another group of staff members. Left alone in the hallway, Cor took a deep breath, trying to center herself in all her years of service. She had dealt with demanding guests before, but something about this situation felt different. The pressure, the expectation, the barely veiled threats, it all added up to a weight that settled heavily on her shoulders. She glanced at her watch. 28 minutes until she needed to deliver that wine. With a sigh, Kora straightened her uniform and headed towards the service elevator. As she descended to the hotel's expansive wine cellar, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was heading into a storm, one that might just sweep her away if she wasn't careful. The wine cell was cool and dimly lit. Rows of bottles stretching into the shadows. Cora moved carefully among them, her eyes scanning the labels. She knew she needed to select the perfect wine. Anything less could spell disaster. After several minutes of searching, she finally found what she was looking for, a bottle of Chateau Margaux Vintage 1982. The price tag made her wince, but she knew this was exactly what Mr. Blackwood would expect. With trembling hands, Cora carefully extracted the bottle from its resting place. She cradled it like a newborn, acutely aware that she was holding something worth more than she made in several months. As she made her way back to the elevator, the weight of the bottle in her hands seemed to mirror the weight of responsibility pressing down on her back. Upstairs, Cora took extra care in preparing the wine. She selected the finest crystal glass, polishing it until it sparkled in the light. With practiced movements, she opened the bottle and poured a perfect measure, the rich ruby liquid catching the light as it flowed. As the appointed time approached, Cora took a moment to check her appearance. In a hallway mirror, she smoothed down her uniform, tucked her stray gray hair back into place, and took a deep breath. The face that looked back at her was lined with years of hard work and quiet endurance. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of pride in her professionalism and her ability to persist despite the odds. But as she picked up the silver tray bearing the wine, that momentary confidence faded, replaced by a growing anxiety. Cora made her way down the plush corridor towards Mr. Blackwood's suite, each step feeling heavier than the last. She paused outside the ornate double doors, gathering her courage. Then, with one last steadying breath, she raised her hand and knocked. The sound seeming to echo in the hushed hallway. Enter came a commanding voice from within. Cora turned the handle, pushing the door open, and stepped into the opulent suite. Little did she know that she was walking into a situation that would test her resilience and dignity in ways she could never have imagined. As Cora stepped into the luxurious suite, the opulence of the room momentarily took her breath away. Plush carpets muffled her footsteps, and the soft glow of crystal chandeliers bathed everything in warm light. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, a vista that Cora had only ever seen from ground level. Her eyes quickly found Mr. Blackwood, who was lounging in a high-backed leather armchair, his gaze lazily sweeping the room as if assessing every detail. "Your wine, sir," Cora said softly, her voice steady despite the nervousness fluttering in her chest. Blackwood's eyes flicked up, sweeping over her with a gaze that felt more like an appraisal than acknowledgement. His lip curled slightly, an expression of distaste that made Cora's stomach clench. "Set it down here," he said dismissively, gesturing to a side table. Cora moved carefully across the room, acutely aware of Blackwood's eyes following her every move. As she placed the tray on the table, she couldn't help but notice the way his gaze lingered on her hands that bore the marks of decades of hard work, with calluses and slightly swollen joints that spoke of countless hours of scrubbing, polishing, and carrying. "Tell me," Blackwood said, his tone deceptively conversational. "How long have you worked here?" "Just a few weeks, sir," Kora replied, straightening up but keeping her eyes respectfully lowered. Blackwood chuckled, a sound devoid of any real mirth. "And let me guess, you thought this job would be your ticket to a cushy retirement, a chance to rub elbows with your betters?" Helen felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she kept her expression neutral. "No, sir, I'm just here to do my job." "Your job," Blackwood repeated, drawing out the words as if tasting them. "And what exactly do you think your job is?" In a place like this, before Cora could respond, Blackwood flicked his cigar, sending ashes scattering onto the pristine carpet. "Your job," he continued, his voice hardening, "is to be invisible, to clean up our messes without being seen or heard, to remember your place." He gestured lazily at the ashes on the floor. "Well, isn't that your job? Clean it up." Cora hesitated for a moment, her pride wearing with the reality of her situation. Then slowly, she knelt down, reaching for a cloth in her apron pocket. "No, no, no," Blackwood said, his tone mocking. "Use your hands. I want to see how well you can serve." Swallowing her dignity, began to scoop the ashes into her palm, the still warm cinders stinging her skin. As she worked, Blackwood continued to smoke, occasionally flicking more ashes onto the carpet around her. He mused, blowing a plume of smoke that made Kora's eyes water. I've always found it fascinating how people like you persist scrabbling for scraps, taking jobs meant for people half your age. Don't you ever just want to give up? Each word felt like a lash against Kora's spirit, but she remained silent, focusing on the task at hand. She had endured worse in her life. She told herself she could endure this. As she finished cleaning the last of the ashes, Blackwood's voice cut through the silence. Once more, while you're down there, my shoes could use a shine. Cora looked up, disbelief etched on her face. Blackwood was leaning forward, his expensive leather shoes thrust towards her while he said, impatience creeping into his voice, I don't have all day. With trembling hands, Cora reached for the shoes. She had no cloth, no polish, nothing but her bare hands and the fabric of her uniform. As she began to rub at the leather, trying to bring out a shine, she could feel Blackwood's eyes on her, could sense the smug satisfaction radiating from him. That's right, he murmured, his voice dripping with condescension. Know your place. This is where you belong, isn't it? Serving your betters. Kora's hands moved mechanically, her mind retreating to a place deep inside where she had weathered many storms before. She focused on her breathing, on the repetitive motion of her hands, anything to block out the cruel words that continued to pour from Blackwood's mouth. I suppose I should commend you for your persistence, Blackwood continued, his voice a mixture of amusement and disdain. It must take a special kind of determination to keep going at your age, doing work meant for younger, more capable hands. He paused, taking a long drag on his cigar before exhaling slowly, the smoke curling around Kora's head. Or perhaps it's just a lack of imagination and inability to see yourself as anything more than a servant. Tell me, did you ever dream of anything better? Or have you always known this was your lot in life? Cora remained silent, her jaw clenched tight against the words that threatened to spill out. She had dreamed once, of course, of a life where her hard work would be recognized, where she could hold her head high, but dreams she had learned were luxuries she couldn't afford. As she finished with his shoes, polishing them as best she could with the limited means at her disposal, Blackwood leaned back in his chair, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. That will do, he said, waving her away, as if showing a bothersome fly. You can go now. Oh, and do try to be less visible next time you come, in your presence is rather distracting. Ka stood slowly, her knees protesting. After so long on the hard floor, she smoothed down her uniform, trying to regain some semblance of dignity. Is there anything else you need, sir? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, a cruel glint in them. Need from you? I think not. Just remember your place, and we'll get along just fine. Now get out of my sight. With a small nod, Cora turned and walked towards the door, her steps measured and careful. She could feel Blackwood's eyes on her back, could almost hear the smug satisfaction in his silence. It was only when the door closed behind her that she allowed her shoulders to slump, the weight of the encounter pressing down on her like a physical thing. For a long moment, she stood there in the hallway, her back against the door, trying to gather herself. The plush carpet, the ornate wallpaper, the soft lighting, all of it seemed to mock her now, a gilded cage that trapped her in a world where she would never truly belong. With a deep stuttering breath, Kora straightened her spine and smoothed her uniform. Once more she had endured, she had survived, and she would continue to do so, no matter what indignities she faced. But as she walked away from Blackwood's suite, a small part of her, a part she thought had long since gone quiet, cried out in protest against the injustice of it all. The corridors of the Imperial Grand seemed endless as Kora made her way through them, her feet moving on autopilot. The opulence that had once aided her now felt oppressive, each gleaming surface and plush carpet a reminder of the world that had just humiliated her. She passed other staff members, their curious glances sliding off her like water off a duck's back. In that moment, Kora felt more invisible than she ever had before. Almost without realizing it, she found herself outside the janitor's room. It was a small utilitarian space tucked away in a corner of the hotel, where guests never ventured. Among the mops, brooms, and cleaning supplies, it was the closest thing to a sanctuary Kora had in this gilded prison. She slipped inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The harsh fluorescent light flickered to life, casting stark shadows across the cluttered space. For A moment COR just stood there, her back against the door, her eyes closed, trying to steady her breathing, but as the adrenaline of the encounter began to fade, the full weight of what had just happened crashed down upon her. The cruel words, the deliberate humiliation, the casual dismissal of her humanity, it all came rushing back in a tidal wave of emotion. Kora's legs gave way beneath her, and she slid down the door until she was sitting on the cold tile floor, her hands still smelling faintly of cigar ash and shoe leather began to tremble, and then for the first time in years, Kora Brooks began to cry. It started as a quiet thing, just a few tears sliding down her weathered cheeks, but soon it grew into deep, racking sobs that shook her entire body. Years of pent-up frustration, anger, and sorrow poured out of her, unstoppable as a breaking dam. As she cried, fragmented memories flashed through her mind. Her first job as a teenager, scrubbing floors in a diner, the pride she had felt at earning her own money, at being able to help her family, the years of hard work that followed, each job blending into the next in an endless parade of service and subservience, the dreams she had quietly nurtured of respect, of dignity, of a life where she could hold her head high, all ground to dust under the heel of reality. And now here she was at 62, still on her knees, still cleaning up after those who saw her as nothing more than a convenience, a tool to be used and discarded. The injustice of it all burned in her chest, mixing with a deep, aching sadness for the life she had lived and the woman she had become. Why, she whispered to the empty room, her voice hoarse from crying. Why is this all there is? But the janitor's room with its mops and buckets offered no answers. The silence was broken only by the hum of the fluorescent light and Kora's gradually quieting sobs. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in her grief and anger. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that small, cluttered space, but eventually the storm of emotion began to subside, leaving Kora feeling hollow and drained. With trembling hands, she wiped at her face, trying to erase the evidence of her breakdown. She knew she couldn't stay here forever. The hotel wouldn't stop running just because her world had been shaken. There were still rooms to clean, guests to serve, a job to be done. Slowly, painfully, Cora began to pull herself together. She stood up on shaky legs, using a nearby shelf for support. Her uniform was wrinkled, her hair disheveled, her eyes red and puffy, but none of that mattered. She had to get back to work. She had to endure, as she always had. Just as she was about to reach for the door handle, it turned on its own. Kora's heart leapt into her throat as the door swung open, revealing Mr. Thompson, his face flushed with anger. Brooks, he barked, his eyes narrowing as he took in her disheveled appearance. What the hell are you doing in here? I've been looking everywhere for you. Cora opened her mouth to respond, to explain, to apologize, but no words came out. She stood there frozen as Mr. Thompson's face grew redder by the second while he demanded, stepping into the small room, his bulk seeming to fill the entire space. Explain yourself. Cora swallowed hard, her throat dry and constricted. I just needed a moment, Mr. Thompson, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. A moment, Thompson repeated incredulously. We don't have moments to spare in this hotel, Brooks, especially not when we have VIPs like Mr. Blackwood staying with us. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he took in Kora's red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands. What happened up there? Cora took a deep breath, steeling herself. Mr. Blackwood, he was very demanding. He made me clean cigar ashes off the carpet with my bare hands and then shine his shoes while he was wearing them. He said some very unkind things. As she spoke, she could see Thompson's expression hardening, not with sympathy, but with growing anger. When she finished, he let out a long, exasperated sigh. Brooks, he said, his voice dripping with condescension, Mr. Blackwood is one of the most important guests this hotel has ever had. His stay here could mean big things for all of us. And you're telling me you let a few harsh words and some menial tasks reduce you to this? He gestured dismissively at her disheveled state. Cora felt a flicker of indignation. But sir, the way he treated me is irrelevant. Thompson cut her off sharply. Our job is to cater to our guests' every whim, no matter what. If Mr. Blackwood wants you to shine his shoes with your tongue, you ask him which shoe he'd like you to start with. Do you understand? The callousness of his words struck Kora like a physical blow. She stared at him, momentarily speechless, as the reality of her situation sank in. There would be no sympathy here, no understanding to Thompson, to the hotel, to the world she inhabited. She was nothing more than a tool to be used. Now, Tom continued, his tone broken. No argument. You're going to pull yourself together, and we're going To go back up to Mr. Blackwood's suite, you're going to apologize for any discomfort you might have caused him, and you're going to beg for his forgiveness. Is that clear? Cora felt as if the floor was tilting beneath her feet. Apologize, she repeated, her voice small and disbelieving. But I didn't do anything wrong. Thompson's face flushed an even deeper shade of red. Did you not hear a word? I just said it doesn't matter what you did or didn't do. What matters is that Mr. Blackwood is happy, and right now, because of you, he's not, so you're going to fix it. End of discussion. He grabbed Kora's arm, his grip painfully tight, and began to steer her out of the janitor's room. Come on, we don't have all day, and for God's sake, try to make yourself presentable. We can't have you looking like this in front of Mr. Blackwood. As Thompson marched her through the hotel's back corridors, Cora felt as if she was moving through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The injustice of it all seemed too great to be real, yet with each step, the cold reality of her situation became clearer. They paused briefly in a staff restroom where Thompson impatiently waited as Kora splashed cold water on her face and tried to smooth her hair and uniform. The woman who looked back at her from the mirror was a stranger, pale, shaken, with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the span of a few hours. All too soon, they were standing outside Mr. Blackwood's suite. Once more, Kora's heart hammered in her chest as Thompson raised his hand to knock. This was wrong. Every fiber of her being screamed she shouldn't have to apologize. She had done nothing wrong. But as the door swung open, revealing Blackwood's smug face, Cora knew she had no choice. This was the world. She lived in a world where people like her were expected to swallow their pride, their dignity, their very humanity, all in the name of serving those deemed their betters. Mr. Thompson. Blackwood drawled, his eyes sliding dismissively over Kora. I trust you're here to address the issue we discussed earlier. Indeed, Mr. Blackwood. Thompson replied, his tone obsequious. Mrs. Brooks here has something she'd like to say to you. All eyes turned to Kora. She stood there feeling small and insignificant under their scrutiny, the words stuck in her throat, choking her. But with Thompson's expectant glare boring into her, she forced them out. I am sorry, Mr. Blackwood, she began, her voice barely audible. I apologize if I made you feel uncomfortable in any way. It won't happen again. Blackwood's lip curled in a sneer. Oh, I'm sure it won't, he said, his tone dripping with disdain. You know, Thompson, when I first arrived, I couldn't help but notice how this one, he jerked his head towards Kora, seemed to think she was above her station, tossing ashes on the floor, herself acting all high and mighty. It's good to see you've put her in her place. Kora's head snapped up, shock and disbelief written across her face. It was a blatant lie, a complete inversion of what had actually happened. She opened her mouth to protest, but caught Thompson's warning glare. I'm glad we could clear up this misunderstanding, Mr. Blackwood, Thompson said smoothly, pointedly ignoring Kora's reaction. Please let us know if there's anything else we can do to make your stay more comfortable. As Blackwood continued to spew more falsehoods about their encounter, embellishing his lies with each sentence, Kora stood there rooted to the spot. She watched as Thompson nodded along his face, a mask of understanding and apology. And in that moment, something inside her began to crack. This wasn't just unfair, it wasn't just unjust, it was a complete denial of her reality, of her humanity, and yet she was expected to stand there and take it, to apologize for wrongdoings she hadn't committed, to validate lies told about her. As Thompson finally ushered her out of the suite, closing the door on Blackwood's smug face, Cora felt as if she was leaving a part of herself behind, the woman who had walked into that suite earlier that day, a woman who, despite everything, still held on to a shred of dignity and self-respect. Was gone. In her place stood someone Kora barely recognized, someone beaten down, someone who had been forced to betray herself in the most fundamental way. And as Thompson turned to her, his face dark with barely contained anger, she knew that her ordeal was far from over. The walk to Mr. Thompson's office was a blur for Kora. The opulent hallways of the Imperial Grand, which had once filled her with awe, now seemed to close in around her, suffocating in their grandeur. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if she was wading through molasses. Thompson marched ahead of her, his back rigid with tension. He hadn't spoken a word since they left Mr. Blackwood's suite, but Cora could feel the anger radiating off him in waves. It was a silence more terrifying than any shouting could have been. As they reached the door to his office, Thompson paused, his hand on the doorknob. He turned to Kora, his eyes cold and hard inside. He said, his voice clipped And controlled now, Cor stepped into the office, her heart pounding so loudly. She was sure Thompson must be able to hear it. The room was a stark contrast to the luxury of the rest of the hotel, functional and austere with no frills or unnecessary decorations. It was a room designed for business, for laying down the law. Thompson closed the door behind them with a soft click that sounded to Kora like the ceiling of a tomb. He moved around her to sit behind his desk, leaving her standing in front of it. Like a child called to the principal's office. For a long moment, Thompson just stared at her, his fingers steepled in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled, but filled with a fury that made Kora flinch. "Do you have any idea," he began, each word carefully enunciated, "what you've done to today? Do you have even the slightest inkling of the damage you could have caused?" Cor opened her mouth to respond, but Thompson held up a hand, silencing her. "No, don't speak. You've done quite enough of that already today. Now you're going to listen, and you're going to listen carefully." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. "Mr. Blackwood is not just a guest, Brooks. He's a kingmaker. His word can make or break hotels like ours. If he leaves here satisfied, it could mean millions in revenue, expansion opportunities, connections to other high-profile guests. If he leaves unhappy," Thompson trailed off, letting the implications hang in the air. But Sir Cor finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I didn't do anything wrong, Mr. Blackwood. I don't want to hear it," Thompson snapped, slamming his hand on the desk. The sudden noise made Cor jump. "I don't care what happened, what he did or didn't do. All I care about is that he's happy. And right now, because of you, he's not." He stood up, looming over the desk. "Let me make something very clear to you, Brooks. Your only job is to make the guests happy, not to have feelings, not to have dignity, certainly not to cause scenes that require my personal intervention." Cor felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She wouldn't give Thompson the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "I'm going to say this once, and only once," Thompson continued, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "If Mr. Blackwood has any more complaints about you, if he so much as hints at being dissatisfied with any aspect of his stay that can be traced back to you, you're done, not just here, but in every hotel in this city. I'll personally see to it that you never work in this industry again. Do you understand me?" The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Cor felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. This job, as demeaning and difficult as it was all she had at her age. With her lack of formal education, what else could she do? Where else could she go? "I asked you a question, Brooks," Thompson barked, snapping her out of her thoughts. "Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Cor managed to say, her voice small and defeated. "I understand." Thompson sat back down, seemingly satisfied. "Good, now get out of my sight. And remember, I'll be watching you very closely. One more slip up, and you're gone." Cor turned and walked out of the office, her legs feeling like lead. As the door closed behind her, she leaned against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. The full weight of what had just happened, of the precariousness of her situation, came crashing down on her. She had been humiliated, aided, lied about, and now threatened with the loss of her livelihood. And for what? For daring to have a moment of human weakness, for not being servile enough in the face of cruelty. As she slowly made her way back to her duties, Cor felt something inside her changing. The quiet dignity she had always tried to maintain, the small flame of self-respect she had nurtured through years of hardship, they were flickering, threatening to go out entirely. In their place, a cold, hard knot of despair began to form. Is this all there is? She wondered. Is this what the rest of my life will be? Serving people who see me as less than human, always one misstep away from disaster. But she had no answers. There was only the work ahead of her, the endless tasks that needed to be done, the facade of servility she needed to maintain. And so, with a heavy heart and a spirit close to breaking, Cor Brooks returned to her duties, the weight of her circumstances pressing down on her more heavily than ever before. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Kora. She moved through her tasks mechanically, her body going through the motions while her mind reeled from the events of the day. The luxurious corridors of the Imperial Grand, once a source of wonder, now felt like a gilded cage, each gleaming surface a reminder of her precarious position. As the hours wore on, exhaustion began to set in, not just physical tiredness from the labor of her job, but a bone-deep weariness that seemed to seep into her very soul. The weight of Mr. Blackwood's cruelty, Thompson's threats, and Her own forced complicity and her humiliation pressed down on her, making each step, each task feel like an immense effort. The other staff members gave her a wide-berth word of her encounter with Mr. Blackwood, having spread through the hotel's efficient gossip network. Their sidelong glances and hushed whispers followed her as she worked, adding to her sense of isolation. As night fell and the hotel's rhythms changed, Kora found herself assigned to the late shift. The corridors grew quieter, the guests retreated to their rooms, and the skeleton crew of night staff took over in the relative calm. The events of the day seemed to loom even larger in Kora's mind. She was cleaning one of the lower floor corridors when Mr. Sun's voice cut through the quiet. "Brooks," he called, his tone curt and impatient. "I need you to take fresh towels up to the penthouse suite." Kora's heart sank. The penthouse suite? Mr. Blackwood's room? "Yes, sir," she replied quietly, her voice barely audible as she gathered the towels and made her way to the service elevator. Thompson fell into step beside her. "Remember what we discussed?" He said, his voice low and threatening. "No mistakes, no scenes. You're to be invisible, understand?" Kora nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As the elevator doors closed between them, she saw Thompson's eyes narrow, watching her until the last possible moment. The ride up to the penthouse felt interminable. With each floor that passed, Kora's anxiety grew. What if Mr. Blackwood was awake? What if he decided to torment her again? What if she did something wrong and Thompson made good on his threats? When the elevator finally reached the top floor, Kora took a deep breath, steeling herself. She stepped out into the plush corridor, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The door to the penthouse loomed before her, imposing and intimidating. With trembling hands, she knocked softly. There was no answer. She knocked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. Relief flooded through her. Mr. Blackwood must be asleep or out. Quietly, she used her master key to let herself in. The suite was dark and silent, confirming that it was empty. Kora moved quickly to the bathroom, intent on leaving the fresh towels and getting out as fast as possible. But as she arranged the towels on the rack, something caught her eye. There on the marble countertop was Mr. Blackwood's wallet. It lay open, revealing a thick wad of cash and several credit cards. For a moment, Kora froze, staring at the wallet. A wild thought flashed through her mind: how easy it would be to take some of that money, just a bill or two, enough to give her a cushion, maybe even enough to quit this job and find something else. Mr. Blackwood would never miss it. It would be a small revenge for how he had treated her. The thought was gone almost as quickly as it had come, leaving Kora feeling shaken and ashamed. No matter how badly she was treated, she was not a thief. She had her pride, her integrity. It was all she had left. Hurriedly, she finished arranging the towels and left the suite, locking the door behind her. But as she walked back to the elevator, the weight of what had just happened, not what she had done, but what she had been tempted to do, crashed down on her. This job, this place, was changing her. It was making her consider things she never would have before. It was eroding not just her dignity, but her sense of who she was. As the elevator descended, Kora felt the last of her strength give way. The tears she had been holding back all day began to fall slowly. At first, then in great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. By the time she reached the ground floor, she was crying so hard she could barely see. Blindly, she stumbled out of the elevator and down the corridor, not caring where she was going, just needing to get away. She found herself back in the janitor's closet, that small cluttered space that had become her refuge. Collapsing onto an overturned bucket, Helen let her grief and despair pour out of her. She cried for the humiliation she had endured, for the threats hanging over her head, for the person she was becoming in this gilded prison. She cried for the dreams she had once held, now ground to dust under the heels of people like Blackwood and Thompson. She cried for the unfairness of a world that could treat a human being as nothing more than a tool to be used and discarded. Time lost all meaning. As Kay sat there consumed by her sorrow, she didn't hear the door open, didn't notice the figure standing in the doorway, watching her with a mixture of concern and curiosity. It was only when a gentle hand touched her shoulder that Kora looked up, her tear-streaked face coming face to face with a well-dressed black man in his late 40s. His expression was one of genuine concern, a stark contrast to the disdain and indifference she had faced all day. "Is everything all right?" he asked softly, his voice kind and filled with genuine concern. In that moment, as Kora looked into the stranger's compassionate eyes, she felt something shift. Little did she know that this unexpected encounter was about to change everything. Kora blinked, her vision blurry from tears as she tried to make sense of the man standing before her. His presence in this small, cluttered janitor's room seemed incongruous, his tailored suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to the mops and cleaning supplies surrounding them. I'm fine, Kora stammered, hastily wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. It was an automatic response born from years of hiding her true feelings, of pushing down her pain to present a composed facade to the world. The man's eyebrow raised slightly, a small sad smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Forgive me, he said gently, but I don't think someone who's fine would be crying alone in a janitor's closet at this hour. There was something in his tone, a warmth, a genuineness that caught Kora off guard. She had become so accustomed to dismissal and disdain that this simple act of kindness threatened to undo her completely. Who are you? She managed to ask, her voice hoarse from crying. The man straightened up, smoothing down his suit jacket. My name is David Hallway, he said, extending his hand. I'm the owner of this hotel. Cora felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. The owner, her mind raced, panic setting in. Had Mr. Thompson sent him? Was this the end of her job, her livelihood? Seeing the fear in her eyes, David quickly added, please don't be alarmed. I'm not here to cause you any trouble. I was doing a late-night walkthrough of the hotel when I heard you, I just wanted to make sure everything was all right. Cora stared at him, unsure of what to say. Or do years of conditioning had taught her to be wary of those in power, to expect the worst? But there was something in David's eyes, a genuine concern that she couldn't dismiss now. David said, pulling up another overturned bucket and sitting down across from her, would you like to tell me what's got you so upset? Mrs. Brooks, chorus supplied automatically. Kora Brooks. David nodded encouragingly. Mrs. Brooks, what's happened? And suddenly, like a dam breaking, words began to pour out of Kora. She told him everything about Mr. Blackwood's cruelty, about being forced to apologize for things she hadn't done, about Mr. Thompson's threats. As she spoke, she watched David's face, expecting to see disbelief or dismissal. Instead, she saw his expression darken with each new detail, his jaw clenching in barely contained anger. When she finally fell silent, emotionally spent, David leaned forward, his eyes intense. Mrs. Brooks, he said, his voice low and serious, I want you to know that what happened to you today is completely unacceptable. It goes against everything this hotel should stand for, everything I believe in as a business owner and as a human being. Cora felt a glimmer of hope, quickly tempered by years of disappointment. But Mr. Thompson said, Mr. Thompson, David cut in, his tone sharp, does not have the final say in how this hotel is run or how its employees are treated. I do. He stood up, offering his hand to Kora, and I think it's high time we address this situation. Will you come with me? Cora hesitated for a moment, years of caution wearing with a desperate need to be heard, to be believed. Finally, she took David's hand, allowing him to help her to her feet. As they left the janitor's closet, David turned to her. Mrs. Brooks, I want you to know that you're not alone in this. What happened to you is wrong, and I intend to make it right. Are you ready to confront this? Cora took a deep breath, feeling a strength she thought she had lost begin to stir within her. Yes, she said, her voice steady. For the first time in hours. Yes, I am. David nodded, a determined look in his eyes. Then let go have a word with Mr. Blackwood, shall we? As they walked towards the elevator, Cora felt a mix of emotions churning within her, fear, hope, anger, and a small but growing sense of vindication. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't facing her battles alone, and as the elevator doors closed behind them, she realized that this night, which had started in despair, might just end in justice. The ascent to the penthouse suite seemed to take both an eternity and no time at all. Kora's heart raced, a mixture of anxiety and a strange, unfamiliar feeling of empowerment coursing through her veins. Beside her, Mark Lewis stood tall and composed, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. As the elevator chimed, announcing their arrival at the top floor, David turned to Kora. Are you ready for this, Mrs. Brooks? He asked, his voice gentle but firm. Cora took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. Yes, she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Yes, I. And they stepped out into the plush corridor, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The door to Mr. Blackwood's suite loomed before them, no longer an insurmountable barrier, but a challenge to be faced. David raised his hand and knocked firmly on the door. For a moment there was silence. Then from within the suite came the sound of movement, followed by an angry voice. Do you have any "Idea what time it is? How dare you disturb me at this hour?" The door was yanked open, revealing Mr. Blackwood, his face flushed with anger. He was dressed in an expensive silk robe, his hair disheveled, eyes blazing with indignation. But as he took in the sight before him, David in his impeccable suit and Kora still in her maid's uniform, his expression shifted from anger to confusion. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his gaze darting between David and Kora. Without waiting for an invitation, David stepped forward, smoothly maneuvering past Blackwood and into the suite. Cora followed, her heart pounding, but her step steady. "Mr. Blackwood," David said, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of steel, "I'm David Lewis, the owner of this hotel. We need to have a conversation about your treatment of my staff." Blackwood's face cycled through a range of emotions: surprise, confusion, and then a sort of smug confidence. "Owner or not," he said, drawing himself up to his full height, "you have no right to barge in here at this hour. Do you have any idea who I am, the connections I have?" David remained unfazed. "I'm well aware of who you are, Mr. Blackwood, but right now that's not important. What's important is how you've been treating Mrs. Brooks here." Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he looked at Kora, recognition dawning. "The maid? This is about the maid?" He let out a derisive laugh. "I was told this matter had been handled, that she had been properly chastised for her impertinence." Helen felt a surge of anger at his words, but before she could speak, David stepped in. "Mrs. Brooks has done nothing wrong," he said, his voice hard. "In fact, from what I've heard, it's you who owes her an apology." Blackwood's face contorted with indignation. "Apologize to her?" He gestured dismissively. "As Kora, do you have any idea who you're talking to? I could buy and sell this entire hotel with the change in my pocket." David remained unmoved. "Mr. Blackwood, your wealth doesn't give you the right to mistreat my employees. Mrs. Brooks has worked hard her entire life, and she deserves to be treated with respect and dignity." "Respect, dignity?" Blackwood scoffed. "For a maid, next you'll be telling me I should bow and scrape to the bellhops?" He turned to Kora, his eyes cold. "Listen here, you should be grateful for the job you have. People like you, that's enough." David's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. The sudden sharpness in his tone made both Blackwood and Cora flinch. "I've heard enough. Your behavior is completely unacceptable." For the first time since they entered the room, David smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, but one that held a hint of steel. "Mr. Blackwood, let me be very clear. I don't care who you are, who you know, or how much money you have in this hotel. Every guest and every employee is treated with respect. If you can't abide by that simple rule, then I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to leave." The color drained from Blackwood's face. "Leave? You can't be serious. Do you know how much I'm paying for this suite?" "The amount you're paying is irrelevant," David replied calmly. "What matters is how you treat people, and based on what I've seen and heard, you've fallen far short of the standards we expect from our guests." Blackwood sputtered, his usual arrogance crumbling in the face of David's unwavering resolve. This is outrageous. I'll sue. I'll ruin you." David remained unperturbed. "You're welcome to try, Mr. Blackwood, but I think you'll find that treating people with basic human decency is not only the right thing to do, it's also protected by law. Now I'm going to have to ask you to pack your things. We'll have a car ready to take you to another hotel within the hour." As the reality of the situation sank in, Blackwood's bluster deflated. He looked from David to Kora, his expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning comprehension. For the first time, he seemed to truly see Kora not as a faceless servant, but as a human being who had stood up to his cruelty. I didn't mean," he began, but David cut him off. "Save it, Mr. Blackwood. Your actions speak louder than any words you might offer. Now, please pack your things. A member of our staff will be here shortly to assist you with that." David turned to leave, gesturing for Kora to follow. As they reached the door, he paused and looked back at the now silent Blackwood. "Oh, and Mr. Blackwood, I suggest you use this experience as an opportunity for reflection. The world is changing. People like Mrs. Brooks aren't invisible anymore, and it's high time men like you realize that." As the door closed behind them, Cora felt as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She looked at David, tears of relief and gratitude welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. I've never had anyone stand up for me like that before." David smiled, a warm, genuine smile this time. "Mrs. Brooks, you deserve to be stood up for. What happened to you was wrong, and I'm just sorry I didn't know about it sooner." His expression turned serious. "But our night isn't over yet. We still have one more stop to make." As they walked towards the elevator, Kora realized that David was right. There was still one more person they needed to confront, one more wrong that needed to be righted. And for the first time in years, Kora felt ready to face whatever came next. She wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. The elevator ride down from the penthouse was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than before. No longer oppressive, it was now filled with a sense of anticipation of justice about to be served. Kora stood tall beside David, her earlier fear and despair replaced by a newfound strength. As they stepped out onto the main floor, David turned to Kora. "Mrs. Brooks, I want you to know that what's about to happen, it's not just about Mr. Blackwood, it's about creating a workplace where everyone is treated with respect. Are you ready?" Cora nodded, her voice steady. "Yes, Mr. Lewis, I'm ready." They made their way through the quiet lobby, their footsteps echoing. In the cavernous space, at this late hour, the hotel was mostly asleep, but they both knew that in the manager's office, Mr. Thompson would still be at his desk. He always worked late, priding himself on his dedication to the job. As they approached the office, they could see the light spilling out from under the door. David knocked firmly, not waiting for a response before opening the door. Mr. Thompson looked up from his desk, his face registering surprise at the unexpected intrusion. His eyes widened as he took in David's imposing figure, then narrowed as he spotted Kora behind him. "Mr. Lewis," Thompson said, quickly standing and smoothing down his tie, "this is unexpected. What can I do for you at this hour?" Maris stepped into the office, his presence seeming to fill the room. "Mr. Thompson, we need to talk about the events of today, specifically about your handling of the situation with Mrs. Brooks and Mr. Blackwood." Thompson's eyes darted to Kora, a mixture of anger and fear flashing across his face. "Sir, I can explain. There was a misunderstanding with Mr. Blackwood, but I assure you I handled it appropriately." Mrs. Brooks here was stopped. David cut him off, his voice firm. "I've heard Mrs. Brooks's account of what happened. I've also just had a very illuminating conversation with Mr. Blackwood, and I have to say, Mr. Thompson, I'm deeply disappointed in how you've managed this situation." Thompson's face paled. "Sir, I was just trying to protect the hotel's interests. Mr. Blackwood is a very important guest, and a guest's importance does not give them the right to mistreat our staff." David interrupted. "And your job, Mr. Thompson, is not just to cater to wealthy clients, it's to ensure that this hotel runs smoothly and ethically. That includes protecting the dignity and rights of our employees." Thompson's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "But sir, I was just following protocol. In situations like these, we always side with the guest. It's how we maintain our reputation." David's eyes hardened. "And what about our reputation as an employer? What about our duty to protect our staff from abuse and discrimination? Did you consider that when you forced Mrs. Brooks to apologize for something she didn't do, when you threatened her job if she didn't comply with Mr. Blackwood's unreasonable demands?" The color drained from Thompson's face as he realized the full extent of what David knew. He turned to Kora, his expression a mixture of anger and desperation. You went over my head after everything I've done for you." Before Cora could respond, Maris stepped between them. Miss Brooks did what any employee should feel safe doing when they're being mistreated. She spoke up. The fact that she felt she couldn't come to you, her direct supervisor, with these concerns is a damning indictment of your management style. Mr. Thompson slumped back into his chair, the fight seeming to leave him. "What would happen now?" he asked, his voice small. David's expression was resolute. "Mr. Thompson, your actions today have shown a complete lack of integrity and a failure to uphold the values of this hotel. You prioritized appeasing a wealthy guest over protecting a hardworking employee from abuse. You threatened Mrs. Brooks's livelihood when she was the victim in this situation. This is not the kind of leadership we need or want in this hotel." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I'm afraid I have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately." Thompson's head snapped up, shock written across his features. "Terminate? But I've been with this hotel for 15 years. You can't just." "I can, and I am," David said firmly. "Your years of service make your actions today even more disappointing. You should have known better. Please clean out your desk and turn in your keys. Security will escort you out." As if on cue, two security guards appeared in the doorway. Thompson looked at them, then back at David and Kora, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. Without another word, he began to gather his things, his movements mechanical and defeated. David turned to Kora, his expression softening. "Mrs. Brooks, I know this has been a difficult day for you. Would you mind waiting for me in the lobby? I'd like to have a word with you once this is taken care of." Cora nodded, feeling a complex mix of emotions: relief, vindication, and a touch of pity for Thompson. Despite everything he had done, as she left the office, she heard David instructing the security guards to ensure Thompson left the premises without incident. In the quiet of the lobby, Kora sat down on one of the plush sofas, her mind reeling from the events of the past hour. The day that had started with humiliation and despair was ending with a sense of justice and hope she hadn't felt in years. As Cora sat in the lobby, David approached her. "Mrs. Brooks, would you mind joining me in my office? I think we have a lot to discuss." In David's welcoming office, he sat next to Cora instead of behind his desk. "Mrs. Brooks, I want to apologize for what happened today. It should never have occurred in my hotel. Cor felt tears welling up. Mr. Lewis, you have nothing to apologize for. You've done more for me tonight than anyone has in I don't know how long. David smiled sadly. Mrs. Brooks, if you're comfortable, I'd like to hear more about your experiences, not just today, but throughout your life. For the first time in years, Cor began to talk. She spoke of growing up with limited opportunities, her first job as a teenager scrubbing floors in a diner, and the parade of service jobs that followed. She recounted the dreams she had quietly known, nurtured, of respective dignity, and how those dreams had been slowly ground down by reality. As she spoke of her time at the Imperial Grand, of the casual indignities and the constant fear of losing her job, David listened intently, his face a mixture of sadness and determination. When Kora finished, David spoke. Mrs. Brooks, thank you for sharing your story. Your resilience is truly inspiring. I have a proposition for you. Helen looked at him curiously. I'd like to offer you a new position within the hotel. David continued, not as a maid, but in administration, a role where you can use your knowledge and experience to help us create a better work environment for all our employees. It would involve less physical labor, better pay, and a chance to make a real difference in how this hotel operates. Cor sat there stunned. Mr. Lewis, I don't know what to say. Are you sure? I don't have any formal qualification for a role like that. David smiled warmly. You have years of real-world experience and a perspective that we desperately need. Who better to help us address the challenges our frontline staff face every day? Helen felt tears of joy. She thought of all the years she had spent feeling invisible, unheard, unvalued. And now here was an opportunity, not just for a better job, but for a chance to make things better for others like her. Yes, she said, her voice choked with emotion but firm with resolve. Yes, Mr. Lewis, I accept. David beamed, shaking her hand. I'm glad to hear it, Mrs. Brooks. Together we can make the Imperial Grand a place where every employee feels valued and respected. In the weeks that followed, Kora's life underwent a transformation. Her new role in administration came with challenges, but for the first time in decades, these were challenges that invigorated rather than depleted her. The physical toll of cleaning for hours was gone, replaced by the mental stimulation of learning new systems and contributing ideas. Kora found herself becoming a bridge between management and the frontline staff, able to articulate the needs and concerns of workers in a way that those who had never walked in their shoes simply couldn't. One evening, about a month into her new role, Kora found herself alone in the hotel lobby. She sat on a plush sofa, reflecting on her journey. She thought of her younger self, full of dreams and determination, taking that first job at the diner. She remembered the parade of jobs that followed, each one wearing away a little more of her hope. Cor reflected on the countless times she had been overlooked and mistreated, yet through it all she had persevered. In the face of humiliation and hardship, she had maintained her dignity. When the world tried to render her invisible, she had insisted on her own humanity. As she gazed out at the twinkling city lights, Cor felt a profound sense of triumph, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been in her position, every maid, janitor, dishwasher, and service worker who had ever been made to feel less than human. Cor stood up, smoothing down her new business attire. As she made her way towards the exit, she passed a group of cleaning staff. She greeted each of them by name, asking about their families, their concerns, making mental notes of issues to address in the next staff meeting. One of the younger maids, Maria, looked at her with admiration. Mrs. Brooks, do you really think things are going to change around here? Kora smiled, squeezing the young woman's shoulder. They already are, Maria, and we're just getting started. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, Kay felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. She knew there was still much work to be done, but for the first time in her life, she felt truly empowered to face those challenges. The night was clear, the stars visible even through the city's glow. As Kay began her walk home, she felt unburdened. The weight of years of silent suffering had been lifted, replaced by the strength of someone who had reclaimed her voice, her dignity, and her power. Cor carried with her the hope of a brighter future, not just for herself, but for all those who had ever felt unseen and unvalued. Her story wasn't just one of personal triumph, it was a beacon of change, a promise that with perseverance, courage, and the support of principled leaders willing to take a stand, even the most deeply entrenched systems could be transformed. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of resilience and justice. If Kora's story touched your heart as much as it did ours, I've handpicked another inspiring tale I know you'll love. Please don't miss it. Click here to watch it next. Disclaimer: This channel is in opposition to all forms of human rights violations, intolerance, bigotry, and discrimination. The narratives that are presented here are original works that were designed to encourage constructive dialogue, comprehension, and introspection. Respect for diversity and the preservation of human dignity are the guiding principles for the creation of all content.